The village of Upper Thornfield had always prided itself on its roses. Every June, when the climbing varieties reached their full glory along the honey-coloured stone cottages and the formal gardens of Thornfield Manor burst into magnificent bloom, the annual Rose Festival drew visitors from 3 counties. This year's festival promised to be particularly splendid, as the weather had been kind, and Mrs. Agatha Pemberton, the formidable chairwoman of the village committee, had secured the services of a renowned rosarian from the Royal Horticultural Society to judge the competitions. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a white canvas pavilion on the manor's south lawn, a cup of Earl Grey balanced carefully on her knee and her knitting bag resting beside her chair. She had been invited to Upper Thornfield by her old school friend, Mrs. Dorothy Ashford, whose late husband had been the village doctor for nearly 40 years. Dorothy had insisted that a change of air and some proper roses would do Miss Marple a world of good, though Miss Marple privately suspected that her friend was rather lonely in the large Victorian house that had once bustled with patients and family. From her vantage point beneath the pavilion, Miss Marple could observe the festival's proceedings with the practiced eye of someone who understood that human nature revealed itself most clearly during social gatherings. The gentle click of her knitting needles provided a soothing rhythm as she worked on a lavender shawl for the church jumble sale, though her pale blue eyes missed very little of the drama unfolding around her. The centerpiece of the festival was the competition for the Pemberton Cup, awarded annually for the finest rose garden in the village. This year, the contest had generated unusual excitement, as newcomer Mrs. Vivian Blackwood had dared to challenge the decades-long supremacy of Major Reginald Thornfield, the manor's owner and descendant of the family for whom the village was named. Major Thornfield stood near the entrance to his prized rose garden, a tall, spare man with military bearing and a carefully waxed mustache. At 65, he retained the ramrod posture of his army days, though Miss Marple noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward his prize-winning Queen Elizabeth roses. The tremor might have been age, but something in his manner suggested it was more likely suppressed emotion. 30 years I've won that cup, he was saying to Dr. Michael Hartwell, of the village's current physician. 30 years of careful cultivation, proper feeding, systematic pruning, and now this woman thinks she can waltz in with her modern methods and upset the natural order. Dr. Hartwell, a pleasant man in his early 40s with the kind of bedside manner that inspired confidence, nodded diplomatically. Change can be difficult, Major, but competition does tend to bring out the best in people. Competition, the Major snorted. That's not competition, that's revolution. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment as she observed this exchange. The Major's reaction seemed rather extreme for a gardening contest, suggesting that more than horticultural pride was at stake. She had learned over many years of village life, and that the most passionate disputes often had their roots in matters quite separate from their apparent subject. The object of the Major's distress soon became apparent as Mrs. Vivian Blackwood approached, accompanied by a small entourage of admirers. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair arranged in a fashionable style and clothes that spoke of London shops rather than provincial dressmakers. Her garden at Rose Cottage had indeed created quite a sensation, featuring innovative techniques and rare varieties that had drawn gasps of admiration from the morning's visitors. "Major Thornfield?" Mrs. Blackwood said with a smile that was perfectly polite, and yet somehow managed to convey a subtle challenge. "What a magnificent display you have this year, though I must say, I was surprised to see you've stuck with the traditional approach. Some of us have been experimenting with more contemporary methods." The Major's face flushed a deep red. "Traditional methods, madam, have served this village well for generations. We don't need outsiders coming in with their newfangled ideas, disrupting what has worked perfectly well." "Outsiders?" Mrs. Blackwood's eyebrows rose delicately. "How curious. I was under the impression that Upper Thornfield welcomed new residents. particularly those who contribute to the community. Her gaze flicked meaningfully towards the new church organ, which bore a small brass plaque acknowledging her generous donation. Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing interest. The tension between the two was palpable, and she noticed that several other villagers had paused in their conversations to listen. Mrs. Pemberton, the festival chairwoman, looked distinctly uncomfortable as she hurried over to defuse the situation. Now, Mrs. Pemberton said with forced cheerfulness. We're all here to celebrate our beautiful roses, aren't we? The judging will begin shortly, and I'm sure our expert will have a difficult decision to make. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a young man standing at the edge of the rose garden. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair and an intense expression, dressed in clothes that had once been expensive but now showed signs of wear. He was watching Mrs. Blackwood with an expression that combined longing and resentment in equal measure. That's Mrs. Blackwood's stepson, Timothy. Mrs. Ashford explained, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple. Poor boy's had rather a difficult time of it. His father died last year, left everything to his second wife. Timothy expected to inherit naturally, but apparently the will was quite specific. How unfortunate, Miss Marple murmured, though her tone suggested she found it more interesting than unfortunate. Young men do sometimes find it difficult to accept such disappointments gracefully. Indeed, and there's been some unpleasantness about it. Miss Marple filed this information away as the afternoon progressed. The judging began at 3 o'clock, with Mr. Cornelius Weatherby, the expert from the Royal Horticultural Society, making his careful rounds accompanied by the committee. He was a precise, scholarly man who examined each rose with the intensity of a detective studying evidence. The crowd followed the judging party at a respectful distance, and Miss Marple noticed the various reactions as Mr. Weatherby made his assessments. Major Thornfield maintained his military composure, but his jaw was set in a rigid line. Mrs. Blackwood appeared serenely confident, though Miss Marple caught her glancing frequently at her stepson, who had positioned himself near the garden gate with the air of someone prepared to make a hasty exit. It was just after 4 o'clock when the judging party reached Mrs. Blackwood's garden at Rose Cottage. The crowd pressed forward eagerly, and Miss Marple found herself with an excellent view of the proceedings. Mr. Weatherby spent considerable time examining Mrs. Blackwood's innovative plantings, making notes in a leather-bound book and occasionally asking technical questions that she answered with evident expertise. Remarkable, he murmured, studying a climbing rose of unusual coloring. I haven't seen this variety outside of specialized collections. However did you manage to establish it so successfully? Mrs. Blackwood smiled. Trade secrets, Mr. Weatherby, though I must credit my late husband's research. He was quite the botanist, you know. It was at this moment that Timothy Blackwood stepped forward from the crowd. His face was flushed, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Research, he said loudly. Is that what you call it? Stealing other people's work and claiming it as your own? A shocked silence fell over the gathering. Mrs. Blackwood's composure wavered for just an instant before reasserting itself. Timothy, she said quietly, this is neither the time nor the place for such discussions. Isn't it? Timothy's voice rose. When better to expose the truth? These roses, this garden, none of it would exist without my father's work. Work that you've stolen and perverted for your own glory. Major Thornfield stepped forward, his military instincts asserting themselves in the face of public disorder. Young man, you're making a spectacle of yourself. Whatever your grievances, they should be settled privately. Privately? Timothy laughed bitterly. Like everything else in this village. All the little secrets and arrangements. Well, some things deserve to be public, Major. Some truths need to be told. Mrs. Pemberton fluttered forward, wringing her hands. Please, Timothy, think of the festival. Think of the visitors. Surely this can wait until... Until when? Timothy interrupted. Until she's collected another prize for work that isn't hers? until she's fooled everyone completely." Mrs. Blackwood's face had gone very pale, but her voice remained steady. "I think you've said quite enough, Timothy. Perhaps you should go home and reflect on your behavior." "My home?" Timothy's laugh was harsh. "You mean the cottage you've so graciously allowed me to rent from you? How very generous, stepmother dear." The tension was broken by Mr. Weatherby clearing his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps," he suggested, "we might continue the judging at another time, as these matters seem rather personal." But before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the uncomfortable silence. It was Mrs. Pemberton's maid Sarah, running across the lawn with her apron flying and her face white with terror. "Mrs. Pemberton," she gasped, "come quickly! Something terrible has happened in the greenhouse." The crowd turned as one toward the large greenhouse that stood at the far end of Mrs. Blackwood's garden. Through its glass walls, Miss Marple could see overturned plant pots and what appeared to be a figure lying motionless among the scattered earth and broken glass. Dr. Hartwell pushed through the crowd, his medical training taking precedence over social convention. Miss Marple followed at her own measured pace, her knitting forgotten for the moment. She had learned that in moments of crisis, and the most important observations were often made in the first few minutes before shock and confusion clouded people's memories. By the time she reached the greenhouse, Dr. Hartwell was kneeling beside the prone figure. It was Mrs. Blackwood, lying face down among her prized orchids, a garden trowel clutched in one hand, and her silver hair stained with something darker than earth. "She's dead," Dr. Hartwell said quietly, his professional composure not quite masking his shock. "Head injury. Appears to have struck the edge of the potting bench as she fell." Major Thornfield peered over the doctor's shoulder. "Accident, then. Perhaps she felt faint in the heat." But Miss Marple, standing quietly in the doorway, had noticed something that the others in their distress had overlooked. The greenhouse door, which should have been latched securely to protect the delicate plants from drafts, was standing wide open. And on the glass near the door, barely visible unless one knew where to look, was the faint outline of a handprint, too large and too high to have been made by Mrs. Blackwood herself. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "I do hope this isn't going to spoil the festival entirely. Though I suspect," she added, watching as Timothy Blackwood stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been relief, that Upper Thornfield's troubles are only just beginning. The church bells, which had been ringing the hour with their usual gentle persistence, seemed suddenly to carry a more ominous note as they echoed across the village. As Miss Marple, adjusting her hat against the evening breeze, prepared herself for what she suspected would be a most complex and revealing investigation into the hidden currents of village life. The police arrived within the hour, summoned by Dr. Hartwell's urgent telephone call to the constabulary in Market Ledbury. Inspector George Craddock, a methodical man in his 50s with graying temples and the patient demeanor of someone well-versed in rural investigations, took charge of the scene with quiet efficiency. His sergeant, a younger man named Jenkins, began the delicate process of taking preliminary statements while the inspector examined the greenhouse with the thoroughness that had earned him his reputation throughout the county. Miss Marple, having been gently but firmly shepherded back to the pavilion by Mrs. Ashford, unsettled into a chair with the appearance of an elderly lady somewhat overwhelmed by the afternoon's tragic turn of events. Her knitting bag rested in her lap, forgotten for the moment, while her pale blue eyes observed the unfolding drama with the sharp attention of someone who understood that human nature revealed itself most clearly in moments of crisis, when carefully maintained social masks began to slip. The festival guests had been asked to remain on the grounds until preliminary statements could be taken, creating an atmosphere thick with nervous energy and hushed speculation. Small groups formed and reformed across the manor's lawn like patterns in a kaleidoscope, voices rising and falling in waves of conjecture and barely suppressed excitement. Miss Marple noticed how people positioned themselves, and who sought whose company for comfort, and who carefully avoided certain conversations. The widow Mrs. Henderson gravitated toward Major Thornfield, perhaps seeking the reassurance of masculine authority, while the younger mothers clustered protectively around Mrs. Pemberton, their children forgotten in the urgency of adult drama. Timothy Blackwood had been taken aside immediately for questioning, which surprised no one given his public confrontation with his stepmother mere minutes before her death. He sat now on a stone bench near the manor's terrace, his head buried in his hands, while Sergeant Jenkins maintained a respectful but watchful distance. Miss Marple observed that Major Thornfield had positioned himself nearby, ostensibly dead-heading his prize roses, but clearly keeping Timothy within his line of sight. The Major's expression was difficult to read, combining what might have been suspicion with something that looked oddly like satisfaction, as though events were unfolding exactly as he had expected them to. Mrs. Pemberton fluttered between groups like an agitated butterfly, alternately wringing her hands and attempting to maintain some semblance of festival normalcy. She paused beside Miss Marple's chair, her round face creased with genuine distress. "What a terrible thing, Miss Marple. And during our festival of all times. The village will never recover its reputation. People will always remember Upper Thornfield as the place where that dreadful accident happened." She lowered her voice to a conspirative whisper. "Though, between you and me, I'm not entirely certain it was an accident, though that poor woman had made rather a lot of enemies in her short time here." Miss Marple made a sympathetic murmur, her fingers automatically finding her knitting needles. Had she indeed? I must confess, I knew very little about Mrs. Blackwood beyond her obvious skill with roses. Mrs. Pemberton glanced around nervously before continuing. "Oh, accomplished, certainly, but rather too accomplished, if you take my meaning. Always showing off her knowledge, her London connections, her generous donations to the church, and the way she treated that stepson of hers, cutting him off completely from his own father's estate. Is it any wonder the boy was bitter?" After Mrs. Pemberton hurried away to console another group of distressed festival-goers, Mrs. Ashford settled beside Miss Marple with a weary sigh. Poor Vivian, whatever her faults, she didn't deserve this. Michael Hartwell is quite shaken naturally. He's been treating her since she arrived in the village last autumn. Some health matter, though he's too discreet to say what exactly. Professional confidence and all that. Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. A health matter. How interesting. She seemed quite robust this afternoon. Appearances can be deceiving, Jane. You know that as well as anyone. Though I must say, she did seem in particularly excellent spirits lately. Almost triumphant, one might say, especially about this rose competition. She told me just last week that she expected to win, and that it would prove something important, though she wouldn't elaborate on what she meant. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by certain inconsistencies that seemed to escape everyone else's attention. The timeline, for instance, troubled her considerably. Mrs. Blackwood had stormed away from the confrontation and headed directly toward her greenhouse, but the maid's scream had come barely 3 minutes later. Hardly enough time for a proper argument, let alone the kind of sustained rage that would lead to murder. And then there was the matter of the greenhouse door, standing wide open to the elements when it should have been carefully latched to protect the delicate plants within. Most intriguing of all was Timothy himself, who now sat with the defeated posture of someone who had lost his last anchor in the world, rather than the defiant bearing one might expect from a man who had just achieved his revenge. Inspector Craddock emerged from the greenhouse as the shadows lengthened across the manor's lawn, his expression grave and measured. He conferred briefly with Dr. Hartwell before approaching the assembled crowd with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. The festival guests pressed forward eagerly, their earlier shock giving way to that peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that violent death invariably provokes in otherwise respectable people. "Ladies and gentlemen," the inspector began, his voice carrying clearly across the evening air, I regret to inform you that Mrs. Blackwood's death is being treated as suspicious. The circumstances require thorough investigation, and I must ask that none of you leave Upper Thornfield without providing contact details to Sergeant Jenkins." He paused, toward allowing the implications to settle. "Those present in the immediate vicinity of Rose Cottage between 4 o'clock and the discovery of the body will need to provide formal statements." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed immediately by agitated conversation. Miss Marple observed how people reacted to this official confirmation of their private suspicions. Major Thornfield's expression remained stoically unchanged, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped his walking stick. Mrs. Pemberton looked as though she might faint, requiring support from 2 younger committee members. Timothy Blackwood simply stared at the inspector with hollow eyes, as if the news had drained whatever remaining energy he possessed. What particularly interested Miss Marple was the reaction of Mr. Cornelius Weatherby, the rose expert from the Royal Horticultural Society. He had been standing quietly at the crowd's edge, his leather notebook clutched in one hand, and at the inspector's announcement his face took on an expression of profound dismay, mixed with what appeared to be reluctant calculation. He glanced toward the greenhouse, then at his watch, then back at the inspector with the air of someone making an unpleasant but necessary decision. "Inspector," Mr. Weatherby said, stepping forward with obvious reluctance, "I believe I may have information relevant to your investigation. Though I hesitate to speak ill of the deceased, professional integrity compels me to mention certain irregularities I discovered during my examination of Mrs. Blackwood's garden." The crowd fell silent, all attention fixed on the rose expert. And Inspector Craddock gestured for him to continue, his expression neutral but attentive. "During my assessment of the roses at Rose Cottage," Mr. Weatherby explained carefully, "I noticed several specimens that bore the characteristics of a very rare hybrid developed by the late Professor Edmund Blackwood. These particular roses were the culmination of nearly 20 years of careful breeding work, and Professor Blackwood was notoriously protective of his research. He had not, to my knowledge, shared the propagation methods with anyone before his death last year." Major Thornfield leaned forward intently. "What exactly are you suggesting, Weatherby?" "I'm suggesting nothing definitive, Major. I'm merely stating facts. Mrs. Blackwood claimed these roses were the result of her late husband's research she had supposedly inherited, and continued. However, I happen to know that Professor Blackwood maintained a private laboratory at his previous residence in Sussex, and that laboratory was sealed after his death, pending resolution of estate matters." Timothy Blackwood rose unsteadily to his feet, his face transformed by sudden animation. "That's exactly what I've been trying to tell everyone. Those roses, that research, all of it should have been mine. My father promised I would inherit his life's work. But she convinced him to change everything, and then after he died, she moved here and set herself up as some kind of botanical genius using his achievements." Inspector Craddock held up a hand for silence. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand your distress, but I must caution you about making accusations without evidence. Mr. Weatherby, are you formally alleging that Mrs. Blackwood obtained these plants illegally?" The rose expert shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not qualified to make legal judgments, Inspector. I can only say that the presence of these particular specimens raises questions that would have required investigation. I had, in fact, planned to speak with Mrs. Blackwood privately after the judging to request documentation of her acquisition and propagation methods." Dr. Hartwell, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. "Inspector, if I may add something from a medical perspective. The injury that killed Mrs. Blackwood was remarkably precise. The blow struck exactly the right spot to cause immediate unconsciousness and subsequent death. In my experience, such precision is unusual in crimes of passion. It suggests either extraordinary luck or considerable anatomical knowledge." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved steadily as she absorbed this flood of new information. The botanical theft provided Timothy with an even stronger motive than simple inheritance. but Dr. Hartwell's medical observation troubled her considerably. Timothy's public outburst had been emotional and uncontrolled, hardly the behavior of someone planning a calculated attack requiring anatomical precision. Mrs. Ashford leaned close and whispered, "This puts rather a different complexion on things, doesn't it? If Vivian was involved in something questionable, perhaps Timothy had more cause for his anger than we realized." But Miss Marple was thinking about something else entirely. She was remembering the handprint on the greenhouse door, a positioned well above her own reach and, she now realized, probably above Timothy's as well. The young man was of average height, perhaps 5 feet 8 inches. The handprint had been much higher, suggesting someone considerably taller. Major Thornfield, for instance, stood well over 6 feet. As the crowd began to disperse under police supervision, Miss Marple noticed how Major Thornfield positioned himself near Timothy, ostensibly offering support, but actually maintaining a careful watch over the young man's movements. There was something in the Major's bearing that suggested not surprise at these revelations, but rather a grim satisfaction, as though events were unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her pale blue eyes taking in every nuance of behavior around her. So the case was becoming considerably more complex than a simple inheritance dispute. Someone in this gathering possessed both the height to leave that handprint and the knowledge to deliver such a precisely calculated blow. And that someone had been clever enough to ensure that all suspicion would fall naturally upon the obvious suspect, while they themselves remained above reproach. The church bells chimed 8 o'clock. As the last of the festival guests were escorted away for questioning, their melancholy notes seeming to echo the growing shadows that were settling over Upper Thornfield like a shroud of secrets waiting to be unveiled. The following morning brought a gentle drizzle to Upper Thornfield, and the kind of persistent English rain that seemed to wash the very air clean while leaving everything glistening and somehow more vivid than before. Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Ashford's morning room, ostensibly occupied with her knitting while observing the comings and goings in the lane outside. The village was buzzing with news that Timothy Blackwood had been taken in for intensive questioning, and several residents had already begun speaking of the matter as though his guilt were established fact. Inspector Craddock arrived just after 9 o'clock, declining Mrs. Ashford's offer of breakfast, but accepting tea with evident gratitude. He settled into the chintz armchair with the careful movements of a man who had spent much of the night poring over evidence and witness statements. "I hope you don't mind my calling so early," he began. "But I understand you were particularly well positioned to observe yesterday's events, Miss Marple. Sometimes a fresh perspective can illuminate details that official investigation might overlook." Miss Marple set down her knitting with a gentle smile. "I'm afraid my observations are those of an elderly lady more interested in roses than in police work, Inspector, though I did notice 1 or 2 small things that seemed rather curious." "Small things often prove most significant," Craddock replied, extracting his notebook. "Please, anything you remember could be helpful." "Well," Miss Marple began thoughtfully, "there was the matter of the greenhouse door. Anyone familiar with orchid cultivation knows they're terribly sensitive to temperature changes and drafts. Mrs. Blackwood struck me as far too experienced a gardener to leave that door standing open, particularly with her prize specimens inside." The inspector nodded approvingly. Dr. Hartwell mentioned the same observation. He'd visited her greenhouse several times and said she was fanatical about proper climate control. "And then there was the handprint on the glass," Miss Marple continued, "positioned rather high up, suggesting someone considerably taller than Mrs. Blackwood herself. Of course, I may be mistaken, but it did seem significant." Mrs. Ashford leaned forward with interest. "But Timothy Blackwood isn't particularly tall, is he? Rather average in stature, I'd say." "Precisely the point that troubles me," Inspector Craddock agreed. "Young Blackwood's movements after the confrontation are reasonably well documented. Several witnesses saw him heading directly toward the village, and he was observed at various points along the way. The timeline would have made it extremely difficult for him to reach the greenhouse, commit murder, and return unnoticed." Miss Marple resumed her knitting with steady precision. "I've often observed, Inspector, that people who intend genuine violence rarely announce their intentions so publicly beforehand. It's the ones who shout and threaten who seldom follow through with actual harm. Real murderers tend to be much quieter about their grievances." "Yet his fingerprints were found on the garden trowel near the body," Craddock said carefully, "though that proves little, since he'd visited the greenhouse on previous occasions." "A garden trowel," Miss Marple mused. "Such a precise instrument for what should have been a crime of passion." And Dr. Hartwell mentioned the remarkable accuracy of the fatal blow. "In my experience, Inspector, such precision suggests either extraordinary luck or considerable anatomical knowledge." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Pemberton's arrival, announced by the maid with obvious reluctance. The festival chairwoman appeared haggard, her usual bustling energy replaced by nervous agitation. "Oh, Inspector," she burst out before proper greetings could be exchanged, "I simply must tell you about my conversation with Major Thornfield this morning. He's most insistent that the case should be closed quickly. Says it's bad for the village's reputation. Sir, but I couldn't help remembering the terrible argument he had with Vivian just 2 days ago." Craddock's attention sharpened immediately. "What sort of argument, Mrs. Pemberton?" "I was arranging flowers in the church when they passed by the vestry door. Vivian was saying something about old debts coming due and people getting what they deserve. The Major was absolutely furious, told her she was playing a dangerous game and would ruin everything if she wasn't careful." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. "Old debts. How very interesting. It seems Mrs. Blackwood had a talent for uncovering things people preferred to keep buried." "There's more," Mrs. Pemberton continued breathlessly. "Dr. Hartwell told me in confidence that Vivian had been taking medication for her nerves lately. She'd become convinced someone was watching her house at night, a tall figure in her garden." The inspector and Miss Marple exchanged meaningful glances. The handprint, the tall figure, the Major's height, and his convenient absence during the crucial time period, the pieces were beginning to form a pattern quite different from the obvious solution. "It appears," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Mrs. Blackwood's murder was not the spontaneous act of an angry young man, but rather the calculated response of someone with far more to lose than a gardening competition. Someone who discovered that their carefully guarded secrets were no longer safe." Outside, the church bells began their morning call to service, and their familiar notes somehow carrying an ominous undertone as they echoed across the rain-washed village where nothing was quite as peaceful as it appeared. The Sunday service at St. Michael's was better attended than it had been in years, a phenomenon Miss Marple had observed many times before. Death, she reflected as she walked with Mrs. Ashford through the drizzle-dampened lanes, had always possessed a peculiar magnetism for the living. People who normally pleaded urgent domestic duties or troublesome joints suddenly found themselves compelled to seek divine guidance when tragedy struck their community. The ancient church stood solid and reassuring against the grey morning sky, its Norman stones darkened by moisture and its stained glass windows glowing softly from within. Miss Marple paused at the lich gate, ostensibly to adjust her umbrella, but actually to observe the unusual gathering. The churchyard was dotted with black umbrellas and hushed conversations, creating an atmosphere of subdued excitement that had little to do with religious devotion. Timothy Blackwood was notably absent, which Miss Marple found significant. According to Mrs. Ashford, he had been a regular attendee, more from habit than faith. His absence suggested either genuine grief or a consciousness of guilt that made public appearance unbearable. Near the church porch, Major Thornfield stood in conversation with Dr. Hartwell, his military bearing as rigid as ever, though Miss Marple noticed how his eyes kept straying toward the lane as though expecting someone who would not come. Inside, the familiar sense of damp stone, old hymn books, and yesterday's festival lilies created a comforting atmosphere that seemed to steady the congregation's nerves. Miss Marple and Mrs. Ashford settled into their customary pew, positioned perfectly for observation, without appearing to stare. The Reverend Lionel Brooks had clearly struggled with his sermon preparation, delivering hastily revised remarks about life's fragility and divine purpose, while his own eyes wandered restlessly over his flock. Most interesting to Miss Marple was Major Thornfield's behavior during the service. He maintained his usual upright posture, but tension radiated from every line of his body. When Reverend Brooks spoke of hidden sins brought to light, the Major's knuckles whitened as he gripped the pew back before him. His responses to the familiar prayers seemed automatic, as though his mind was occupied with far more pressing concerns than spiritual matters. After the final hymn, the congregation lingered in the churchyard despite the persistent drizzle. Miss Marple moved slowly among the groups, her apparent frailty allowing her to drift unnoticed within earshot of various conversations. It was near the war memorial that she encountered Mrs. Pemberton in animated discussion with Mr. Weatherby, who appeared increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment. "The will, you see," Mrs. Pemberton was saying in hushed but excited tones, "was changed only last month. Dorothy Ashford's housemaid heard it from Rose Cottage's parlour maid. Vivian received papers from her London solicitor, and afterward she seemed positively triumphant about something. Not a penny more for poor Timothy, they say. But a substantial bequest to some botanical institution." Mr. Weatherby shifted uneasily. "Such matters should remain private until properly resolved through legal channels, Mrs. Pemberton. Though I will say that certain botanical foundations have been most eager to acquire Professor Blackwood's research materials. The competition has been quite intense in professional circles." Miss Marple allowed her knitting bag to slip, providing an excuse to linger as she retrieved it. "How very interesting," she murmured. "It seems Mrs. Blackwood held considerable influence over her late husband's legacy." "Indeed," Mr. Weatherby replied carefully. "But if she intended to donate everything to a foundation, that would represent a permanent loss for anyone who had hoped to benefit from those discoveries. Some people might find such a prospect quite devastating." The conversation was interrupted by Major Thornfield's approach, his walking stick clicking sharply against the wet stones. "Still discussing yesterday's unpleasantness, I see," he said with forced joviality. "Though I should think the matter is quite straightforward. Young Blackwood's public outburst followed by violence when his threats failed to achieve their purpose. A regrettable but hardly mysterious sequence of events." Miss Marple observed how quickly the Major sought to direct suspicion toward Timothy, and how his certainty seemed almost rehearsed. In her experience, truly innocent bystanders tended toward sympathy for the accused rather than such decisive condemnation. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple suggested a gentle walk to Rose Cottage, and ostensibly for fresh air, but actually to examine the scene with renewed attention. The constable on duty nodded respectfully as they passed, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to study the property's layout more carefully. What she discovered proved illuminating indeed. Behind the greenhouse, partially concealed by a magnificent climbing rose, ran a narrow service path that connected directly to the lane. Anyone familiar with the cottage's grounds could approach the greenhouse completely unseen from the main garden, particularly during a crowded festival when attention was focused elsewhere. The path showed signs of recent use, with disturbed gravel and a clear footprint in the soft earth near the greenhouse's rear entrance. "How very convenient," Miss Marple murmured, examining the print more closely. It was large, suggesting a tall person with substantial boots, and the depth indicated someone of considerable weight moving quickly. As they prepared to leave, they encountered Dr. Hartwell's sister Lucy, carrying her brother's medical supplies. She seemed nervous at seeing them, offering explanations before questions were asked. "I've just been to the manor," she said hurriedly. "Major Thornfield twisted his ankle yesterday afternoon, just before the discovery. Michael sent me with liniment and bandages. The Major says it happened as he was heading toward the greenhouse, but the pain forced him to turn back." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. A conveniently timed injury that provided an excuse for being near the scene while explaining why he hadn't actually been present when the body was discovered. And in her long experience with human nature, such coincidences rarely proved to be coincidental at all. The church bells chimed the hour as they walked home through the gathering dusk, their familiar notes seeming to carry an ominous undertone. Miss Marple was beginning to perceive the true shape of the puzzle before her, and it had very little to do with an angry young man's public outburst, and everything to do with carefully calculated deception by someone with far more to lose than a gardening competition. Monday morning brought Inspector Craddock back to Upper Thornfield with news that transformed the investigation entirely. Timothy Blackwood had been released from custody after evidence emerged that made his guilt highly improbable. The timeline of his movements, his witness testimony, placing him well away from Rose Cottage during the crucial period, and most significantly, the physical impossibility of someone of his modest stature delivering such a precisely calculated blow, had combined to shatter the case against him. Miss Marple received this intelligence while taking morning tea with Mrs. Ashford and Mrs. Pemberton, the latter having arrived bearing a collection of photographs taken during Saturday's festival. The local newspaper's photographer had captured the event thoroughly, and Mrs. Pemberton had been organizing these images for the village archive when certain details had arrested her attention. "Look here," Mrs. Pemberton said, spreading the photographs across the tea table with trembling fingers. This one was taken just minutes before the confrontation between Timothy and his stepmother. See who's standing in the background near the greenhouse?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the image with characteristic thoroughness. Major Thornfield was clearly visible, positioned strategically near Rose Cottage's side gate, his attention focused not on the judging party, but directly on the greenhouse itself. His expression, though partially obscured by shadow, suggested watchful tension rather than casual interest. "And this one," Mrs. Pemberton continued, selecting another photograph, "was taken during the actual confrontation. Everyone's attention is naturally on Timothy and Vivian, but notice the Major at the frame's edge. He appears to be checking his pocket watch." Mrs. Ashford leaned forward with growing excitement. As though he were waiting for something specific to happen at a particular time. How extraordinarily suspicious. Inspector Craddock, who had been studying the photographs with professional interest, looked up gravely. "These images corroborate other evidence we've uncovered. Mr. Weatherby has confirmed that Professor Blackwood's botanical research represents a substantial financial asset. Pharmaceutical companies have expressed serious interest in derivatives of his hybrid roses for medical applications. We're discussing sums potentially reaching tens of thousands of pounds." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm, which would explain Mrs. Blackwood's recent triumph and her stepson's desperation, but surely there were others with financial interests in this research. "Indeed," Craddock confirmed. "As we've discovered that Major Thornfield invested heavily years ago in a horticultural venture backed by Professor Blackwood. The project failed spectacularly, and Thornfield lost a considerable sum. According to correspondence we've found, he blamed Edmund Blackwood entirely and never forgave the financial ruin." Mrs. Pemberton gasped. But that would mean if Vivian succeeded with Edmund's research, profiting from the very work that had destroyed the Major financially. "The sense of injustice would be overwhelming," Miss Marple agreed quietly, "particularly for a man of the Major's rigid principles and fierce pride." Dr. Hartwell's arrival interrupted their discussion, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Inspector, I've reviewed Mrs. Blackwood's medical records more thoroughly as you requested. She had been consulting me regularly about what she described as threatening behavior from someone she couldn't identify. She specifically mentioned feeling watched by a tall figure who seemed intimately familiar with Rose Cottage's grounds. Someone who might know about the service path behind the greenhouse? Miss Marple inquired gently. Dr. Hartwell nodded grimly. She mentioned that path specifically. said someone had been using it to access her property at night, someone who understood the layout well enough to move completely undetected. Mrs. Pemberton's face had grown increasingly pale. There's more, I'm afraid. Yesterday I discovered that Vivian had been making extensive inquiries about property boundaries in the village. Rose Cottage's parlour maid mentioned seeing old survey maps spread across her desk, and with certain manor estate boundaries marked in red ink. The implications struck them all simultaneously. Mrs. Ashford voiced what everyone was thinking. Good heavens, you don't suppose she discovered irregularities in the manor's property claims? The Thornfield family holdings were reorganized after the war, and there were always whispers about disputed boundaries. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. Old debts coming due, as she told the Major. Perhaps she had uncovered evidence that would challenge the very foundation of his family's position in Upper Thornfield. Inspector Craddock gathered the photographs thoughtfully. A man like Major Thornfield, faced with the prospect of financial ruin, legal challenges to his ancestral home, and public humiliation, might well consider murder preferable to exposure. Particularly, Miss Marple added softly, if he possessed the anatomical knowledge necessary to deliver such a precisely calculated blow. Military training does include certain unfortunate skills. Outside, the church bells chimed noon with crystalline clarity, their familiar notes seeming to herald not peace, but the approaching resolution of secrets too long buried in Upper Thornfield's deceptively tranquil soil. The second shock came to Upper Thornfield not with the familiar toll of church bells, but with the urgent rap of Inspector Craddock's knuckles on Mrs. Ashford's door just after 2 o'clock that Tuesday afternoon. Miss Marple, who had been quietly working on her lavender shawl while observing the comings and goings in the lane, looked up as her friend hurried to answer the summons with obvious trepidation. "There's been a break-in at Rose Cottage," the inspector announced without preamble, his usual measured composure strained by the rapid succession of events. The constable discovered it during his afternoon rounds. "Given your astute observations yesterday, Miss Marple, I wondered if you might accompany me to examine what's been disturbed." They found Timothy Blackwood already at the cottage gate, his face bearing the haggard expression of someone who had spent sleepless nights confronting unwelcome truths. His appearance had deteriorated markedly since his release from custody, his clothes rumpled and his hands trembling with nervous exhaustion. "I came as soon as I heard," he explained to Inspector Craddock. "The cottage was my father's before Vivian inherited it. I thought perhaps I might notice what others would miss." He paused, struggling with some internal conflict. "There are things about my stepmother, about my father's work, that I haven't told you, things that might be important now." The front door of Rose Cottage stood at an odd angle, one hinge wrenched partially from its frame by someone in considerable haste. Inside, muddy footprints tracked across the hall carpet, and Miss Marple bent to examine them with her characteristic attention to detail. "Larger than the prints we found on the service path," she observed quietly, "and deeper, suggesting either greater weight or more urgent movement. Our intruder was either a substantial person or someone driven by desperate circumstances." The study told its own story of systematic but hurried searching. Drawers had been emptied onto the carpet, papers scattered everywhere, and the small safe behind the watercolor landscape gaped open like an accusatory mouth. Inspector Craddock stood beside it with his notebook, cataloguing what remained. According to the housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood kept Professor Blackwood's research notebooks here, along with important legal documents. She's quite certain there were 6 red leather volumes. Only 3 remain. He gestured toward the chaos. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. Timothy stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Inspector, I must tell you something about those notebooks. My father's research wasn't just valuable financially. Those roses represented a breakthrough in natural medicinal compounds that could benefit thousands of people. But Vivian intended to sell exclusive rights to a pharmaceutical consortium, effectively locking the research away for decades while they maximized profits. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she absorbed this revelation. So your confrontation at the festival wasn't truly about personal inheritance, but about betrayal of your father's principles. Exactly, Timothy replied, his face flushing with shame. I was angry, hurt, not thinking clearly. The words came out wrong, made me sound like a grasping heir when I was actually trying to protect my father's vision of making his discoveries freely available. Dr. Hartwell arrived as they spoke, carrying his medical bag and wearing an expression of profound reluctance. Inspector, I've been reviewing Mrs. Blackwood's complete medical history as you requested. I'm afraid there's something crucial you need to know about her condition. He set his bag down with visible hesitation before continuing. Vivian Blackwood was suffering from an aggressive brain tumor. The medication I prescribed for her nerves was actually treating symptoms of a far more serious condition. According to the London specialists, she had perhaps 6 months remaining, and those final months would have been increasingly debilitating. The revelation struck them all with varying degrees of shock. Timothy's face went ashen as he sank into a nearby chair. She never told me, he whispered. All those arguments about the research, the inheritance, since she was dying all along. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with thoughtful precision. Which means whoever killed her robbed her of only a few remaining months. That suggests either someone who didn't know about her condition or someone whose secrets were so devastating they couldn't risk even that brief period of exposure. Among the scattered papers on the desk, a small folded note caught her attention. With an apologetic glance at Inspector Craddock, she carefully extracted it from beneath a bundle of survey maps. The handwriting was firm, masculine, unmistakably military in its precision. We must talk before matters go any further, she read aloud. You are playing with things you do not understand. Meet me in the greenhouse at 4 on Saturday, or there will be consequences you may regret. R.T. Inspector Craddock examined the note with growing interest. Reginald Thornfield. This confirms there was a planned meeting between them at the exact time of her death, but it also suggests the Major felt himself in a position to dictate terms. Dr. Hartwell nodded gravely. During our consultations, Vivian mentioned she had compiled documentation about certain irregularities she discovered in village affairs. She was quite cryptic about specifics, but indicated these documents were stored safely and would be revealed at the appropriate time. The constable appeared in the doorway, carrying several charred paper fragments. Found these in the kitchen fireplace, sir. Looks like someone tried to burn them, but the rain last night dampened the chimney. Some bits survived. Miss Marple carefully aligned the torn edges, revealing part of what appeared to be financial records. The surviving portions showed regular monthly payments, always the same substantial amount, extending back nearly 2 years. Blackmail payments, Inspector Craddock observed grimly. Or perhaps hush money. Either way, someone had been paying Mrs. Blackwood considerable sums on a regular basis. An arrangement she recently decided to end, Miss Marple added softly, by making a new will and preparing to expose whatever secrets she'd discovered. That would certainly provoke the consequences mentioned in Major Thornfield's note. As they prepared to leave Rose Cottage, Miss Marple lingered in the doorway, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the violated space. The case was revealing layers of complexity she had anticipated, but the pattern was not quite what it appeared on the surface. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I've often observed that people who intend genuine violence rarely announce their intentions so formally beforehand. That note troubles me, not because it implicates Major Thornfield, but because it seems almost too convenient, too perfectly incriminating." Outside, the church bells began their afternoon call, their familiar notes carrying across Upper Thornfield with a clarity that seemed to promise revelation. But Miss Marple knew that in villages like this one, The most obvious solution was often a carefully constructed deception designed to hide a truth far more complex and dangerous than simple military pride or botanical theft. The real murderer, she suspected, was someone who understood human nature well enough to let others draw the obvious conclusions, while they remained safely above suspicion in the shadows of respectability. Wednesday morning brought Inspector Craddock to Mrs. Ashford's door with revelations that would reshape the entire investigation. Miss Marple set aside her knitting as the inspector settled into the familiar chintz armchair, his expression bearing the weight of discoveries that had kept him working through the night. "We've uncovered the true nature of Mrs. Blackwood's hold over Major Thornfield," he began without preamble. "It wasn't about property boundaries or botanical theft, Miss Marple. It was about murder, the murder of his first wife, Margaret, 15 years ago." Mrs. Ashford gasped audibly, but Miss Marple's pale blue eyes remained steady, though she noticed how her friend's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer. "Dr. Hartwell has come forward with information that Mrs. Blackwood shared with him," Craddock continued. "She possessed medical records from her late husband's files, documenting suspicions that Margaret Thornfield died not of heart failure, as officially recorded, but of gradual arsenic poisoning. Professor Blackwood had been the original physician and harbored doubts he never officially reported." Miss Marple resumed her knitting with thoughtful precision. "Which explains the monthly payments, we discovered. Mrs. Blackwood had been extracting tribute for her silence about a 15-year-old crime." "Exactly. For nearly 2 years, Major Thornfield paid substantial sums to keep this secret buried. But according to Dr. Hartwell, Mrs. Blackwood recently decided to end the arrangement by donating all the blackmail money to a women's charity in Margaret's name. A final humiliation that would expose everything." The morning light filtering through the lace curtains seemed suddenly harsh as the implications settled. Mrs. Ashford spoke in a whisper. "So Reginald killed Vivian to protect himself from exposure for murdering his own wife." "That was our assumption," Inspector Craddock replied carefully. "However, there's a significant complication. Dr. Hartwell examined the Major's ankle injury personally, and the medical evidence indicates it occurred at least an hour before Mrs. Blackwood's death. The swelling pattern and severity make it physically impossible for him to have reached the greenhouse, committed murder, and returned undetected." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Most interesting, so we have a man with overwhelming motive, documented threats, and a convenient alibi that appears medically unassailable." "Dr. Hartwell also revealed something else troubling," Craddock added. "He and Major Thornfield served together in North Africa. The Major saved his life during a particularly difficult retreat, creating a bond of loyalty that Dr. Hartwell describes as absolute. He admits to feeling conflicted about revealing information that might implicate his former commanding officer." "Loyalty," Miss Marple murmured. "Such a double-edged virtue. It can inspire the noblest sacrifices and the most tragic deceptions." After Inspector Craddock departed to pursue further inquiries, Miss Marple suggested a visit to Dr. Hartwell's surgery, till she found him in his consulting room, organizing medical supplies with the mechanical precision of someone seeking distraction from troubling thoughts. "Doctor," she began gently, settling into the patient chair with her knitting bag, "I've been reflecting on medical ethics and the difficult position recent events have placed you in." Dr. Hartwell's hands stilled over his instruments. "It's been a nightmare, Miss Marple. Knowing what I know about Margaret Thornfield, about Vivian's blackmail scheme, about the Major's desperation, I feel complicit in events I should have prevented." "Complicit is a strong word," Miss Marple observed, "though I notice you seem remarkably well informed about the details of Mrs. Blackwood's business arrangements with Major Thornfield." A flush crept up the doctor's neck. "She consulted me about the medical evidence, wanted professional confirmation of her husband's suspicions before proceeding with her plans." "And you provided that confirmation, knowing how she intended to use it?" "I thought she meant to seek justice," he said miserably. I never imagined she would exploit the information for personal gain. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm. Yet when she changed her approach, deciding to expose everything through charitable donation, you must have realized the devastating impact on your old commander. The man who saved your life would face ruin, disgrace, possibly execution. Dr. Hartwell's face went ashen. Miss Marple, if you're suggesting that I'm suggesting nothing definitive, Doctor. I'm merely observing that loyalty can sometimes drive good men to desperate measures, particularly when they possess both the anatomical knowledge to deliver a precisely calculated blow and the medical authority to direct subsequent investigation. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant chiming of the church bells. Dr. Hartwell's eyes held the trapped expression of someone who had underestimated the perceptiveness of a seemingly harmless elderly lady. The ankle injury was quite clever, Miss Marple continued conversationally, creating an unassailable alibi for the obvious suspect while positioning yourself as the helpful medical expert guiding the investigation. But you made one small error, Doctor. You were too eager to emphasize the precision required for such a killing, too ready to point away from crimes of passion toward calculated murder. Outside, Upper Thornfield continued its deceptively peaceful existence, unaware that the gentle clicking of knitting needles was counting down the final moments before a carefully constructed deception would crumble entirely. Miss Marple spent Thursday morning in careful contemplation, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of someone whose mind was working through the final complexities of human nature. By afternoon, she had formed her plan with the quiet precision that had served her so well in previous investigations. "Dorothy," she said to Mrs. Ashford over their customary tea, "I wonder if you might permit me to invite Dr. Hartwell and Major Thornfield here this evening. Now, there are certain matters I believe might be resolved through gentle conversation." Mrs. Ashford looked alarmed. "Jane, surely you don't mean to accuse them directly?" "Accusation is such an unpleasant word," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I prefer to think of it as allowing truth to emerge naturally. Inspector Craddock has agreed to be present, though discreetly positioned." That evening, the small parlor held an atmosphere of barely suppressed tension. Major Thornfield arrived punctually, his military bearing intact despite the slight favor he showed his injured ankle. Dr. Hartwell followed shortly after, looking drawn and nervous, his usual professional composure noticeably strained. Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting, the picture of elderly innocence. "I've been reflecting on the curious nature of loyalty," she began conversationally. "How it can inspire both the noblest sacrifices and the most tragic mistakes." Dr. Hartwell's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I've also been thinking about medical precision," Miss Marple continued, her needles clicking steadily. "How remarkable it is that Mrs. Blackwood's injury was so perfectly placed, almost as though someone with anatomical knowledge had calculated exactly where to strike for maximum effect." "Miss Marple," Major Thornfield began, but she raised a gentle hand. "Please let me finish. You see, I've noticed several curious inconsistencies. Dr. Hartwell, you are most emphatic about the precision required for such a blow, repeatedly directing our attention to the calculated nature of the attack. Yet you also provided medical verification of Major Thornfield's injury, ensuring he had an unassailable alibi." She paused, studying Dr. Hartwell's increasingly pale face. "Then there was the matter of the medical supplies your sister delivered to the manor. Why would you send treatment if you had already examined and treated the Major's injury at your surgery?" Dr. Hartwell's hands began to tremble. "I don't understand what you're suggesting." "I think you do," Miss Marple said softly. "You were absent from the festival for nearly 45 minutes before the body was discovered, ostensibly visiting a patient. Yet no one in the village recalls seeing you during that crucial period. Because you were at Rose Cottage, weren't you? Using the service path that only someone familiar with the property would know." The silence stretched taut as a wire. Major Thornfield stared at his old comrade with growing horror. "You went there to reason with her one final time," Miss Marple continued, "to beg her to reconsider exposing the Major's secret. But Mrs. Blackwood refused, didn't she? Perhaps she even threatened to implicate you in the cover-up of Margaret Thornfield's true cause of death." Dr. Hartwell's composure finally cracked. "She laughed at me," he whispered. "Said I was a sentimental fool, that Reginald deserved everything coming to him, and that I might face consequences myself for concealing evidence all these years." "So you struck her," Miss Marple said gently, "with the precise knowledge of where such a blow would prove fatal. Then you carefully arranged the scene to implicate Timothy, whose public outburst provided perfect cover." "I never meant—" Dr. Hartwell's voice broke. "I only wanted to protect him. After everything he'd done for me in the desert, saving my life when I was wounded. I couldn't let that woman destroy him over something that happened 15 years ago." Major Thornfield's face was ashen. "Michael, you fool! You damned loyal fool!" From the shadowed hallway, Inspector Craddock stepped forward with 2 constables. "Dr. Michael Hartwell, I am arresting you for the murder of Vivian Blackwood." As the handcuffs clicked shut, Miss Marple set down her knitting with steady hands, though her eyes reflected profound sadness. The loyalty that had once saved a life in the North African desert had ultimately led to murder in an English greenhouse, so proving once again that even the noblest virtues could be corrupted by fear and desperation. Outside, the church bells chimed 9 o'clock, their familiar notes seeming to carry a note of finality as Upper Thornfield's most carefully guarded secret was finally laid bare. The morning after Dr. Hartwell's arrest brought a peculiar quiet to Upper Thornfield, as though the village itself was holding its breath after the revelation that had shattered its trust in one of its most respected residents. Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Ashford's morning room, her knitting needles moving with steady precision, while Inspector Craddock provided the final details of a case that had exposed far more darkness than anyone had anticipated. "Dr. Hartwell made a complete confession last night," the inspector reported, settling wearily into his chair. "He went to Rose Cottage during the festival with no intention of violence, merely hoping to persuade Mrs. Blackwood to reconsider her plans. But she was quite merciless in her response, telling him that both he and Major Thornfield deserved to suffer for concealing Margaret's murder 15 years ago." Mrs. Ashford poured tea with trembling hands. "To think we trusted him so completely. He delivered half the babies in this village, tended our ailments with such care." "That was precisely the tragedy," Miss Marple observed quietly. "His devotion to his patients was genuine, as was his loyalty to Major Thornfield. When Mrs. Blackwood threatened to destroy the man who had saved his life in the desert, Doctor, Hartwell saw only 2 choices: allow his benefactor's ruin or prevent it through desperate action." Inspector Craddock consulted his notes. According to his statement, Mrs. Blackwood took particular pleasure in describing how the Major would be publicly humiliated before facing trial. She apparently laughed when Dr. Hartwell begged her to show mercy, calling him a pathetic little man, still following orders. "Which triggered something fatal in a man already stretched beyond endurance," Miss Marple said. "He saw the garden trowel on the potting bench, and his medical knowledge became a weapon. One precisely calculated blow to cause immediate unconsciousness and subsequent death." "The cruel irony," Craddock continued, "is that Mrs. Blackwood's terminal illness meant she would likely have died before any legal proceedings could conclude. Dr. Hartwell committed murder to prevent an exposure that might never have occurred." Their conversation was interrupted by Timothy Blackwood's arrival, looking considerably more composed than during their previous encounters. He carried several documents and wore the expression of someone who had finally found peace with painful truths. "Miss Marple," he began, "I wanted to thank you for uncovering the truth, however terrible it proved to be. I've also learned some difficult things about my stepmother through Dr. Hartwell's solicitor." His voice grew thoughtful. "She had been planning to reveal her illness and donate the blackmail money to charity all along. Her final will included provisions for me, after all, not the estate, but enough to establish myself independently. Miss Marple smiled gently. She wasn't the monster you had convinced yourself she was. No, Timothy agreed sadly. I've decided to honor my father's original intentions by donating his research to the Royal Horticultural Society, with findings made freely available. It seems the least I can do to redeem something from this tragedy. After Timothy departed, Inspector Craddock addressed the question that had troubled them all. Major Thornfield presents considerable difficulties for prosecution. Professor Blackwood's notes contained suspicions but no definitive proof, and the body was cremated 15 years ago. Without physical evidence, legal proceedings would be nearly impossible. So he may escape earthly justice, Mrs. Ashford said bitterly. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with thoughtful precision. Justice takes many forms, Dorothy. Major Thornfield must live knowing that his crime led directly to Dr. Hartwell's destruction. The man who saved his life has sacrificed everything trying to protect him. That burden will weigh heavily on any conscience not entirely corrupted. As Inspector Craddock prepared to leave, he paused to address Miss Marple directly. When did you first suspect Dr. Hartwell? Miss Marple's pale blue eyes held that distant expression she wore when seeing beyond immediate events into the deeper patterns of human behavior. When he was too eager to emphasize the precision of the fatal blow, thinking he was directing attention away from himself, while actually highlighting his own expertise. Also, his sister's delivery of medical supplies to the manor troubled me. Why treat an injury he'd already examined unless he needed to establish the timing more firmly? After the inspector departed, the two elderly ladies sat in contemplative silence. Outside, the church bells chimed noon with crystalline clarity, their familiar notes promising that Upper Thornfield would eventually heal from the wounds recent events had inflicted. "Will you stay much longer, Jane?" Mrs. Ashford asked. Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps another week, long enough to finish this shawl for the church jumble sale. The secrets that poisoned this village have been exposed to sunlight, and sometimes that's the only cure for what ails a community." She paused, watching sunlight illuminate the roses in the garden, beautiful and innocent, despite the darkness that had temporarily shadowed their peaceful existence. "Though I've learned once again that beneath every village's tranquil surface lie the eternal complexities of human nature, capable of extraordinary kindness and terrible cruelty, often within the same conflicted heart.